The sanctions, which had crippled Iran's economy for years, have been lifted by the United States, the European Union and the United Nations. Iran will now have access to billions of dollars of frozen assets and can sell its oil internationally. Tehran also released 5 Americans, while the United States granted clemency to 7 Iranians as part of a prisoner swap. Leaders from both countries call the deal a milestone in international diplomacy.
Through these negotiations, we have made great powers recognize our nuclear rights, we defeated Iranophobia, we mended our distorted picture, and we demonstrated that the government and the nation of Iran are rational, peace-loving, and at the same time capable of defending their rights.
We have a rare chance to pursue a new path, a different, better future that delivers progress for both our peoples and the wider world.
Joining us now from Tehran is Mohammad Marandi. He's the Dean of the Faculty of World Studies at the University of Tehran. Here with us in the studio is Ali Al-Ahmed. He's the founder and director of the Institute for Gulf Affairs. From Pennsylvania, we're joined by Flynt Leverett. He's a professor of international affairs at Pennsylvania State University and the co-author of Going to Tehran: Why America Must Accept the Islamic Republic of Iran. And also with us in our Washington, D.C. studio is Peter Kuznick. He's a professor of history and the director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Dr. Marandi, let me start with you in Tehran. So sanctions have been lifted, assets have been released. What do you believe will be the immediate impact of the lifting of sanctions?
I don't think there will be an enormous immediate impact. I think it will be gradual. It will take time for the money that has been blocked to come into the Iran, become a part of the Iranian economy, and trade becoming normal again using the banking system. So it does have a psychological impact, of course, but I think that government is also trying to play down expectations right now so that people don't expect that things will improve very suddenly.
Flynt, Iran has lived up to its side of the bargain, but how does one explain the United States' position? The U.S. seems to be sending a mixed message here, because no sooner had the nuclear sanctions been lifted, the U.S. imposed new sanctions on Iran.
Yes, there's no coherent strategic explanation for that. I think really what's going on is that the United States can't make up its mind what sort of relationship it wants to have with Iran moving forward from this nuclear deal. And the kind of compromise position that the Obama administration is pursuing right now is to implement the nuclear deal, but in order to assuage various domestic constituencies, to assuage some of America's so-called allies in the Middle East, Israel and Saudi Arabia first among them, to show that the United States is still tough on Iran, is still out to punish and pressure Iran in areas where, from an American perspective, the United States doesn't like some of the things that Iran continues to do. And I think that's going to continue to be a tension in American policy. And from a strategic perspective, it's not going to be particularly coherent.
Peter, as we are all aware, this dispute, this nuclear dispute, has been going on for many, many years. What do you make of the nuclear deal? Was it a win-win situation? Do you believe that Iran was treated fairly?
Yeah, this really was a win-win situation. The United States policy toward Iran when it comes to nuclear has been quite incoherent for a long time. You have to remember that back during the Carter administration, Jimmy Carter was encouraging the Iranians to develop nuclear power. In fact, Carter had worked out a deal whereby the U.S. was going to sell them 6 to 8 nuclear reactors at that point. Germany and France were going to sell another 16 to 18 at that point. So the United States was encouraging Iran to develop nuclear during that time. Then after the 1979 revolution, then the United States starts to develop a very, very different kind of policy. This was actually very much of a win-win. It was a win for diplomacy, and it's very nice in this world when diplomacy has some successes, and it's going to free up a lot of Iranian assets that were frozen. It's going to lessen the danger of nuclear arms development in the Middle East. So it's an important first step. But there are other nuclear powers in the Middle East, and we need a broader kind of resolution. We need to see this as a first step toward eliminating nuclear weapons from that entire region. That's going to take some smart diplomacy, but at least it's a step in that direction.
Dr. Marandi, getting back to what the response has been like in Iran, as you point out, there has been a psychological impact. How have the markets reacted in the short term, the Tehran stock market, and, of course, the rial, the Iranian currency?
The currency hasn't changed much. It's strengthened very slightly, but the stock market has been on the rise for over a couple of weeks now, contrary to what we see on the other side of the Persian Gulf, where the stock markets took a big hit. And I think it's due to what your guest in the studio has been saying, that the Saudi regime is very much against the deal that was carried out between Iran and the P5+1, and they have fears. But I personally think that those fears are unjustified. Iran has no intention to destabilize Saudi Arabia. Much of the problems that the regime is having is basically because of their own policies. They initiated a war in Yemen, which is bleeding their economy to death, and the extremism that they've helped to create in Syria and Iraq is coming back to haunt them. Otherwise, Iran would rather have good relations with Saudi Arabia. This current administration has tried very hard. The foreign minister has tried very hard, and even in the previous administration in Iran, the foreign minister went to Saudi Arabia, yet his trip was, the Saudi foreign minister never returned the trip.
Flynt, as Peter pointed out, this has been a triumph for diplomacy. In fact, we've heard that from all the negotiators in this deal. But when we look at the alternative, what was the alternative? Was it a war?
I think that the alternative for the Obama administration was either a war, another disastrous U.S.-initiated war in the Middle East, which President Obama, I think, pretty clearly wanted to avoid. The other option was to stick with the sanctions regime, but as President Obama has himself admitted, you were reaching a point with the sanctions regime, particularly the unilaterally asserted U.S. sanctions, where eventually people were going to start calling America's bluff on those sanctions, and they would have collapsed over time. And so in order to avoid those two alternatives, what was left was serious diplomacy. And after, I think, very, very faltering and insufficient efforts at diplomacy during President Obama's first term, the administration got more serious about doing a nuclear deal with Iran. And this deal, which has now gone into implementation, was the result. But it still leaves unresolved these bigger strategic questions of what sort of relationship the United States wants with Iran moving forward from this deal. I'm personally of the view that the United States, for its own interests, needs to reformulate its relationship with Iran on a comprehensive basis. I sometimes draw the comparison with how the United States reformulated relations with China in the 1970s. But there is, at this point, no consensus to do that with Iran in the United States. I would say there isn't even a real consensus within the administration, the Obama administration, to do this. And this is going to be an ongoing struggle, ongoing debate in American foreign policy.
Peter, not everyone is celebrating this deal with Iran. Let's listen to the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu.
Were it not for our efforts to spearhead the sanctions and foil Iran's nuclear program, Iran would already have nuclear weapons long ago. Israel's policy was and remained exactly the same, to not let Iran achieve nuclear weapons. It is clear that from now on, Iran will have more means to use for its terror and aggression activities in the region and in the world.
The one view should be that Israel should welcome this deal. There's no chance of Iran getting nuclear weapons. The Iranian nuclear program has been set aside. Why is Israel so upset?
Well, Netanyahu, much like many in the United States, needs enemies. In order to support, to justify exaggerated levels of defense spending, you need enemies out there. And Iran has been the perfect enemy for the United States and for Israel for many years. Now, Iran, in my opinion, should do something to undercut that. Iran should take an aggressive diplomatic stance toward Israel. Should be making very, very overt public statements about repudiating the crazy Ahmadinejad. I mean, Ahmadinejad's statements were exaggerated, but they should make clear that they want to work with Israel. We know that in the past, Israel and Iran have worked together. We need some aggressive diplomacy on Iran's part in order to undermine the hawks. But it's not only Netanyahu. We see this from Marco Rubio. We see this from Ted Cruz. We see this kind of line
the
from
U.S. presidential candidates.
Yes, from most of the Republican candidates who have not seen this as a victory, but have seen this as a defeat, because they wanted a hardline policy. From the Iranian standpoint, you have to remember that the United States has threatened war repeatedly. Bush put Iran on the axis of evil. He was one of the three initial members of the axis of evil. The United States seriously contemplated a military attack on Iran in 2005. Bush was pushing for that again in 2007. The Israelis were seriously considering attacking Iran in 2010. So from the Iranian standpoint, you've got to see that this is a very hostile world. We can understand why Iran in many ways is very defensive, given the seriousness from people in the United States and in Israel for actually attacking Iran during this period.
Ali, Saudi Arabia said at one stage, threatened at one stage, that it would get a nuclear weapon if Iran got a nuclear weapon. Has that threat now gone away?
I think that threat is a bluff more than anything else, because you need almost an international agreement or a superpower agreement. Pakistan was not going to do it. The Saudis thought they would get it from there, but it's not happening, because Pakistan, which is another nuclear power, did not receive the attention. Everybody talks about Iran, who doesn't have nuclear arms, but Pakistan did it, and it didn't really pay any price for it. So you can see here the double standards in terms of, it's not about nuclear weapons, it's about Iran's policies vis-a-vis Israel and vis-a-vis the United States. So no, the answer to your question is I don't think that Saudis will be able to get that nuclear arms.
Okay.